The air in the Social Security office was thick with the smell of old paper and quiet desperation. I was just another number on a gray plastic chair waiting to talk about my widow's benefits when my phone buzzed. It was Jessica, my daughter. Her voice, when I answered, was so bright it felt sharp. "Mom! Great news!" she chirped. "I know you've been so overwhelmed since Dad passed, so Kyle and I decided to just handle everything." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "Handle what, honey?" "The workshop," she said, like she was announcing she'd cleaned out the garage. "It was just sitting there, a burden. We sold it to a developer. The deal closes tomorrow." The room tilted. The workshop wasn't a building. It was my husband Frank's heart. It was the life we built from sawdust and sweat. Before I could even breathe, she twisted the knife. "Oh, and we even sold Dad's old wood chisels online, got a few $100 for them. Easy money, right? A few $100. For the tools that had built our entire world. That phone call was the sound of my life being sold for parts. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years, starting with the man who built that workshop in the first place. My husband Frank wasn't a man of many words. He spoke with his hands, with the grain of the wood he was shaping. For 45 years he spoke of his love for me not in poems, but in the sturdy kitchen table he built, the smooth rocking chair he made when our daughter Jessica was born, and in the quiet, steady rhythm of his work that filled our home with a sense of purpose. That workshop wasn't just a building on a forgotten industrial street, it was his language. And our daughter had just sold it for scrap. I don't remember leaving the Social Security office. I don't remember the drive. My old Ford Escape seemed to know the way on its own, its engine humming a low, mournful tune. The setting sun was hitting the west-facing buildings, turning the brick to gold, but all I saw was the long, dark shadow of the workshop as I pulled into the gravel lot. It looked smaller somehow. Sadder. The big roll-up door was shut tight, and the windows were filmed with a decade of fine, settled sawdust. For a moment, I just sat there, the keys still in the ignition, my hands shaking on the wheel. This was the first time I'd been here since Frank's funeral. I'd told myself it would be too hard. I had no idea. The old brass key felt cold in my hand. It took a moment to get the lock to turn, the tumblers groaning in protest. The door swung inward with a familiar creak, and the smell hit me first. It was the scent of my entire adult life. The sharp, clean perfume of fresh-cut oak, the sweet tang of varnish, and the faint, bitter aroma of yesterday's coffee still in the pot on Frank's desk. The air was still and heavy. A single ray of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom from a high window, illuminating millions of tiny particles dancing in the air, like tiny ghosts of every project Frank had ever finished here. My eyes went right to the big pegboard wall over his main workbench. Every tool had its place, its outline drawn in black marker so he'd know if something was missing. The hammers hung in a neat row, from biggest to smallest. The saws gleamed dully in the dim light, but in the very center, where his most prized possession should have been, there were just 6 empty hooks. His chisels, not just any chisels, the ones his own father had given him, their steel forged in a factory in Ohio that had closed down 30 years ago. Frank had spent a whole winter turning new handles for them out of black walnut, shaping them to fit the unique curve of his palm. A craftsman is only as good as the tools he knows, he'd always say. Jessica had sold them for a few $100. Easy money. I reached out and my fingers traced the empty space on the wall, and suddenly, I wasn't there anymore. I was 25 years younger, standing in this exact spot on a chilly Saturday morning. The memory was so clear it hurt. I had brought Frank a thermos of coffee, the big red one from Thermos we'd gotten as a wedding gift. He was hunched over the workbench, the air smelling of cherry wood, and he was using one of those very chisels to carve the head of a rocking horse. It was for Jessica's 3rd birthday. He didn't hear me come in over the sound of his mallet. I watched him for a long minute, how his brow furrowed in concentration, how his hands, so big and calloused, could move with such impossible delicacy. He finally looked up and smiled, his face smudged with sawdust. He took the cup of coffee and held up the chisel. "See this?" he'd said, his voice full of a quiet reverence. "My dad taught me with this, said it carved half the furniture in his house. The steel holds an edge like you wouldn't believe." He ran his thumb gently over the polished walnut handle. "It's not about the money, Carol," he said, looking around the workshop, at the stacks of lumber and the half-finished projects. "It's about building something that lasts. Something that your kids' can point to and say, "My grandfather made that." That's all that matters. The memory dissolved, leaving me alone again in the silence, my hand still resting on the cold pegboard. The rocking horse was in Jessica's attic, buried under boxes of old clothes and forgotten electronics. A thing that lasts. What a joke. What had we built, really? We'd raised a daughter who could look at her own grandfather's legacy, at the work of her father's hands, and see nothing more than a price tag. I thought of all the years she'd spent in this workshop, doing her homework at Frank's desk, making a mess with glitter and glue for school projects. He'd helped her build a Pinewood Derby car on that very workbench, letting her think she'd done most of the work. We held her 16th birthday party out in the yard, grilling hot dogs and hamburgers, with all her friends thinking it was so cool and retro. Had she forgotten all of it? Or had it just never meant anything to her in the first place? My grief, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket for months, began to burn. It was changing shape, hardening from a soft sadness into a sharp, cold anger. This wasn't just about a building. This was about respect. It was about a lifetime of hard work being treated like a garage sale full of junk. My daughter, in her infinite wisdom, had decided I was too old and frail to handle my own life. She had patted me on the head and sold my world right out from under me, all for the promise of a shiny new life with a man who probably couldn't even hang a picture frame straight. I wouldn't have it. I was not some helpless old woman to be managed and put out to pasture. I was Carol Brooks. I was the woman who had kept the books for this business for 45 years. I was the one who had made sure the bills were paid, who had stood by Frank through lean years and good ones. I was his partner. This workshop was as much mine as it was his. My name might not be on the sign out front, but my heart was in these walls. I lowered my hand from the pegboard and looked toward the back of the workshop, at the small, cluttered office where Frank had kept all his paperwork. I started walking, my steps sure and steady on the concrete floor. I was no longer there to mourn. I was there to find something. An invoice, a contract, a will, anything. I was looking for a weapon. My daughter had started a war she didn't even know she was fighting. And I'll be damned if I was going to let her win. I was looking for a weapon, and Frank's office was the only armory I had. It wasn't much to look at. Just a small, windowless room he'd framed out in the back corner of the workshop, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was stale, thick with the scent of lukewarm coffee and old invoices. Frank had never been one for paperwork, and it showed. A mountain of supplier catalogs and receipts threatened to spill off his beat-up metal desk. Sawdust covered everything in a fine, pale film, a testament to a man who couldn't be contained by four walls, even when he was trying to pay the bills. My first move was to the filing cabinet, a squealing two-drawer monster he'd probably bought at a garage sale. I pulled open the top drawer. Contracts, tax returns, receipts for lumber orders going back to the Reagan administration. It was the entire financial history of our life together, filed away in mismatched folders. I found a school photo of Jessica from the 3rd grade, all pigtails and a missing front tooth, tucked inside a folder for property taxes. For a second, my anger faltered. How could that little girl, the one who used to follow her dad around this workshop like a shadow, turn into the cold, calculating woman on the phone? I shut the drawer with a sharp metallic clang. I couldn't afford to think about that now. Grief was a luxury, and I was flat broke. I spent the next hour sifting through the clutter, my hands growing grimy with dust and ink. Nothing. No will, no hidden bank statements, no secret document that could undo the damage Jessica had done. Defeated, I finally sank into Frank's old chair. It groaned under my weight, the springs complaining after years of supporting my husband's solid frame. My eyes scanned the shelves above the desk, crammed with dusty binders of OSHA regulations and old tool manuals. It was hopeless. But then I saw it. Tucked behind a row of thick, identical safety binders was something different. A thick, leather-bound book with no title on its spine. It was heavy, clearly old. The dark brown leather was cracked and worn smooth at the corners. I had to stand on my toes to pull it down, a small cloud of dust exploding into the light of the bare bulb. It felt solid in my hands. Important. It felt like Frank. I laid it on the desk and opened it. I was expecting columns of numbers, an old accounting ledger, and the first few pages were just that neatly written records of income and expenses from 30 years ago. But as I flipped further, the entries changed. Frank's strong, no-nonsense handwriting started filling the margins, then entire pages. He had turned this ledger into a kind of journal, a place to put the thoughts he never spoke aloud. My heart began to pound. I read an entry from about a year ago. Vulture from Sterling Development stopped by again. A smarmy fella named Davies offered $500K for the property. Told him the only thing for sale was the sawdust in the bin out back. He didn't laugh. A few pages later, another entry, this one making my blood run cold. Jessica called, asked about the value of the property again, said I should think about my future, start planning for retirement. She doesn't get it. This place isn't about the future. It's about the past. It's her past. Guess she's in a hurry to forget it. So, this wasn't new. This wasn't just Kyle whispering in her ear. This was a resentment she'd been nursing for a long, long time. I kept reading, my fingers tracing his familiar script. The entries got more frequent in the last few months of his life. The developer was clearly turning up the heat. Davies sent a registered letter today, talking about zoning changes and eminent domain, trying to scare me out. He thinks I'm just some dumb woodworker who doesn't know his rights. He doesn't know I spent a whole week at the county law library last winter. A fierce protective pride swelled in my chest. That was my Frank. Quiet, but nobody's fool. He'd seen this coming. He'd been fighting a battle I never even knew existed. I turned to the last few pages, which were filled with notes and calculations. Then, I found it. Tucked into a stiff paper sleeve in the very back of the ledger were official-looking documents, folded into thirds. My hands trembled as I pulled them out. They were heavy, printed on that thick, creamy paper the county uses, with an embossed seal at the bottom. I unfolded the top document. It was the deed to the property. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes catching on phrases and names. And then, the world stopped. The property, the workshop, the land it sat on, everything was not legally owned by Frank's workshop. It was owned by a private holding company. My eyes flew to the name of the company, expecting some clever name he'd come up with. The name on the paper was CJ Enterprises. CJ Enterprises. Carol Jane. My own initials. I read it again, then a third time. Sure, I was mistaken. But there it was, in stark black ink. And listed as the sole proprietor, the president, the only person with any legal authority to sell, lease, or even repaint the front door, was my name, Carol Jane Brooks. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan, a shield. A final silent act of a husband who had spent his life protecting his family. He had put his entire legacy, everything he had ever built, into my hands and my hands alone. He had trusted me to be its guardian. The sheer, unconditional weight of that trust was so powerful, it took my breath away. He knew, somehow, on some level, he knew that I was the only one he could count on to protect it. The fraudulent power of attorney Jessica had used was worthless. The sale she had made was illegal. The developer had bought a piece of property from someone who had no right to sell it. The weapon I had been looking for wasn't a loophole or a forgotten clause. It was me. Just as I was processing this impossible, glorious truth, my eyes fell to the very last entry Frank ever wrote in the ledger, dated just 1 week before he died. His handwriting was a little shaky, but the words were clear. They think the value is in the land. The real gold is in the walls. Wall B, Panel 4. I looked up from the leather-bound book, my gaze sweeping across the dusty, silent workshop. It was no longer a graveyard of memories. It was a fortress. It was my fortress. And I had just been handed the keys to the armory. I had just been handed the keys to the armory. And the first clue to finding the ammunition was written right there in Frank's steady hand. Wall B, Panel 4. I stood up from his desk, the heavy leather ledger still open, and walked back out into the main workshop. The space that had felt like a tomb just an hour ago now felt like a map, a puzzle box waiting to be opened. My mind, which had been foggy with grief for months, was suddenly sharp, clear. Frank was a simple man in the best of ways. He didn't do complicated. The main roll-up door faced south. That was Wall A18. So Wall B had to be the long, uninterrupted wall on the east side of the building, the one currently blocked by stacks and stacks of lumber. Of course, it was the last place anyone would ever bother to look. "All right, Frank," I whispered into the dusty silence. "You always did like to make me work for it." The lumber was heavy. Ponderosa pine, mostly. Thick, 10-foot long 2x12s he'd bought for a big shelving contract that was supposed to happen this fall. Each plank was a dead weight, and my back, the back of a 68-year-old woman who hadn't lifted anything heavier than a bag of groceries from Costco in years, screamed in protest. I ignored it. I moved one board, then another, sliding them off the stack and leaning them against the opposite wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat started to bead on my forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime on my skin. The scent of raw pine was so strong it was almost dizzying. This was work. This was real. This was the feeling Frank had lived and breathed every single day. After 30 minutes of grueling effort, I had cleared a narrow path along the wall. It was simple, unfinished drywall, the seams taped but never painted. Frank had always said, "Function before fashion." I counted the large 4x8 panels from the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4. Panel 4. It looked exactly like all the others. I ran my hands over its surface, feeling for a hidden latch, a secret button. Nothing. I knocked on it. The sound was hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud of the panels next to it. He'd built a cavity in the wall. There were no visible seams, no hinges. I looked closer, my eyes just inches from the wall, and then I saw it. The faintest of outlines, a perfect rectangle about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, disguised by a masterful spackling job. 4 drywall screws, one in each corner, held it in place, their heads filled with putty and sanded smooth. To any normal person, they were invisible, but I had watched Frank work my whole life. I knew his tricks. I went to his workbench and grabbed a claw hammer. The handle felt familiar in my hand, its wood worn smooth from years of his grip. I used the claw to scrape away the putty, then to painstakingly work the first screw out of the drywall. It was slow going. The screw fought me the whole way, its threads biting into the wood frame behind it. Finally, with a sharp screech of metal, it came free. 3 more to go. By the time the last screw was out, my arms ached and my knuckles were raw. I wedged my fingers into the edge of the panel and pulled. It swung open silently on a pair of perfectly oiled recessed hinges. Inside the dark, insulated space was not a safe full of cash or a box of gold coins. It was something far more precious. Dozens of canvas rolls, each about 3 inches thick, were stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. They were tied with simple twine and looked like ancient scrolls. With a reverence I didn't know I possessed, I reached in and took one, then another, until the workbench was covered. I untied the twine on the first roll and spread it out on the flat surface of the workbench, right over a set of half-finished cabinet doors. It was a blueprint, hand-drawn on heavy, cream-colored vellum. The ink was a deep, architectural blue. The lines were clean, precise, and the design itself, it took my breath away. It was for a child's high chair, but with a few simple, brilliant adjustments detailed in the margins, it converted into a sturdy little desk and chair, perfect for a toddler. It was designed to grow with a child, to be a part of a family for years. My hands were shaking as I unrolled the next one. It was a modular bookshelf that used an ingenious interlocking system, requiring no screws or glue. You could start with a small 3-shelf unit and add to it over the years, reconfiguring it into any shape you wanted. It was beautiful, practical, and unlike anything I'd ever seen in a store. One after another, I unrolled them. A coffee table with a top that lifted smoothly to become a dining surface for 2. A hope chest with hidden cedar-lined compartments. A bed frame with built-in space-saving storage that was both elegant and unbelievably clever. This wasn't just furniture. These were solutions. This was the work of a quiet genius who spent his evenings after long days in the shop, not watching TV but sketching, dreaming, and inventing. Tucked inside the blueprint for a stunningly simple rocking chair, a design far more elegant than the one he'd made for Jessica, I found a small folded piece of notepaper. It was addressed to me. His handwriting was a little shaky. This must have been one of the last things he ever wrote. "Carol," it said, "if you're reading this, it means you found my real retirement plan. I knew you would. These were always for us, for our future. Go build it. Love, Frank." I sank onto his workbench stool, the note clutched in my hand, surrounded by the proof of his brilliance. Tears streamed down my face, not of grief, but of a profound, aching love and understanding. The developer, my daughter, her greedy boyfriend, They were all fools. They were fighting over a patch of dirt and a dusty old building. They had no idea what real value was. The real gold wasn't the land. It was this. It was his mind. It was his legacy. It was the future he had secretly been building for me, for us, all along. I carefully, methodically rolled each blueprint back up and tied it with its twine. My anger at Jessica was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut. But it was now overshadowed by a purpose so immense it felt like it could move mountains. I wasn't just the guardian of Frank's past anymore. I was the architect of our future. And the first thing an architect needs is a good lawyer. Frank, in his quiet wisdom, had known that too. Tucked into a small pocket in the back of the leather ledger was a single, crisp business card. It didn't belong to some old family friend who did wills and divorces out of a stuffy office on Main Street. The logo was sleek, modern, and the name was one I'd never heard him mention. Albright and Associates, Intellectual Property and Corporate Law. I found the card along with my courage and I made the call. The next afternoon I was sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car, in a conference room that overlooked the entire city from 30 floors up. The world down below the tiny cars. The bustling people felt a million miles away from the dusty, grounded reality of the workshop. The air in misplaced www.cars. Albright's office was cool and smelled faintly of lemon and success. She was a woman who looked like she was carved from steel and glass. Her suit was sharp, her handshake was firm, and her eyes missed nothing. She didn't offer me coffee or tissues. She offered me her undivided attention, which I was quickly learning was far more valuable. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice calm and direct. "You told my assistant this was about a fraudulent property sale and an inheritance dispute. Please, lay it out for me." I took a deep breath. I was not the grieving widow from the Social Security office anymore. I was a woman on a mission. I reached into my oversized tote bag, the one I usually used for groceries, and placed the heavy leather ledger on the polished surface of the conference table. The thud it made was solid, satisfying. Next, I laid out the official deed to CJ Enterprises. And finally, with the care of a museum curator, I unrolled one of Frank's blueprints, the one for the modular bookshelf, and weighted its corners with 2 heavy glass coasters from the table. Miss Albright's perfectly sculpted eyebrows raised just a fraction of an inch. She didn't speak. She simply picked up the deed and began to read. I watched her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scan the legal jargon. I saw the moment she understood. A flicker of professional admiration crossed her face as she noted the date the holding company was formed nearly 5 years ago. This wasn't a last-minute scramble. It was a long-term strategy. "My daughter," I said, my voice steady, acting under a fraudulent power of attorney she had me sign while I was planning my husband's funeral, sold this property to Sterling Development. Miss Albright placed the deed down gently. She sold property she has no legal title to, using a document signed under duress. The sale is completely void. We can file an injunction and have it nullified by 5 o'clock this evening. I looked at her, at this powerful woman who could undo everything with a single phone call, and I said the words that would change everything. "No, that's not what I want." She leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from a lawyer assessing a case to a strategist studying an opponent. "Go on," she said. "My daughter thinks I'm a helpless old woman. She thinks her father's life's work is a pile of junk to be sold for a quick buck, so she and her boyfriend can play at being rich. If I just nullify the sale, she'll think it was a simple mistake, a clerical error. She won't learn a thing." I paused, letting the weight of my next words fill the silent room. I don't want to just get my property back. I want her to understand deep in her bones what she so carelessly threw away. I want her to feel the consequences. A slow smile spread across Miss Albright's face. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess master who has just been presented with a fascinating new game. Tough love, Mrs. Brooks. A classic but effective maneuver. But direct confrontation is messy. It leads to family court, drawn-out emotional battles. There's a cleaner way to achieve your objective. She leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the developer's name in Frank's ledger. "We don't go after your daughter, we go after the money. Sterling Development is a publicly traded company. The last thing they want is a lawsuit for property fraud on their books. It spooks their investors. We don't send a letter to Jessica." We send a cease and desist letter, by courier, directly to their CEO. We inform them that they are in possession of a contract that is legally void, and that any attempt to take possession of the property will be met with the full force of our firm. She picked up the blueprint, her expression softening for the first time as she studied Frank's work. Your husband wasn't just a cabinet maker, Mrs. Brooks. He was an industrial designer. These designs have significant commercial value. We will include in our letter a notice that they are also now legally barred from any attempt to acquire or replicate this intellectual property. She looked me straight in the eye. We let them do the dirty work. They will freeze the funds. They will sue your daughter for the return of their down payment. They will unleash their own team of corporate lawyers on her. And the consequences you're looking for will arrive at her doorstep not as a gentle knock from her mother, but as a battering ram. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was perfect. It was a plan Frank would have admired. It used logic and leverage, not emotion. It was a master craftsman's solution. My gaze drifted to the window. All those people down there, living their lives, had no idea about the battle that was about to be waged from this sterile, quiet room 30 floors above them. For the first time since Frank died, I felt a surge of something other than grief or anger. It was power. Not the loud, flashy power my daughter was chasing, but a quiet, solid power that came from knowing the facts, owning the truth, and having a plan. I stood up and extended my hand. "Do it," I said. Miss Albright shook my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Consider it done." I walked out of that office and into the blinding afternoon Sunday. I wasn't a widow anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was a client. And we were about to send the bill. We were about to send the bill, but in the world of corporate law, the bill doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives in a quiet, registered envelope, and in the meantime, there is only silence. Miss Albright had been clear. Don't call your daughter. Don't text her. Let them believe they've won. The higher they fly, the harder they'll fall. And so, for 5 agonizing days, I waited. I tended to my small garden, I paid my utility bills, and I tried not to let the anger and anticipation eat me alive. But I didn't need to call my daughter to know what she was doing. She was broadcasting her victory to the whole world. I have an old tablet Frank bought me a few Christmases ago so I could look up recipes. I never used it much, but now it became my window into the life my daughter was living, funded by the sale of her father's soul. Her social media page, once a quiet collection of photos from holidays and birthdays, had exploded into a gaudy, desperate performance. The first post was the car, a gleaming metallic blue BMW that looked like it had been driven straight out of a rap video. Kyle stood in front of it, arms slung around Jessica's shoulder, both of them wearing sunglasses so dark you couldn't see their eyes. He had on a ridiculously tight shirt, and she was wearing a dress that looked like it would fall apart in a light breeze. The caption was pure Kyle. Decided to upgrade our ride to match the ambition. Big things coming. Number entrepreneur. Number crypto life. Number power couple. I looked out my window at my reliable 10-year-old Ford Escape, the one Frank had bought me because of its high safety rating. It was paid for. I wondered how many months of payments on that BMW their down payment had actually covered. A day later, a picture of their dinner appeared. It was one of those restaurants where the plates are huge and the food is tiny. 2 artfully arranged slivers of fish sat on a swirl of green sauce, decorated with a single flower. An incredible, curated dining experience, Jessica wrote. It's not just about food, it's about appreciating the art. I thought of the hearty spaghetti and meatball dinners Frank and I used to host for the whole neighborhood in our backyard. No one ever called it a curated experience, but no one ever left hungry either. This wasn't art, it was an advertisement, an ad for a life they hadn't earned. Then came the post that made my stomach clench. It was a photo of them clinking champagne glasses. In the background, a stunning view of the city skyline at sunset. The caption read, "Making it official. Signed the papers on our new penthouse. So grateful for a partner who manifests his dreams and brings me along for the ride. Number penthouse, number securing the bag, number manifestation." I knew that building. It was the newest, most expensive high-rise downtown. Frank and I had watched it being built, him complaining about their shoddy framing techniques. I also knew that signing the papers on a place like that didn't mean buying it. It meant locking yourself into a lease with so many zeros on it, it made you dizzy. I sat there in my worn armchair, the one with the permanent indent from where Frank used to sit, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock he built filling the silence of my modest living room. I scrolled through this digital fantasy, this cheap performance of wealth, and felt a profound sadness. They weren't building a life, they were building a brand. A hollow, fragile thing that could be shattered with a single gust of wind. And then, I saw the final post. It was the one that erased any last shred of doubt, any lingering maternal instinct to protect my daughter from what was coming. It was a close-up photo of her hand. Her nails were perfectly manicured, painted a deep, glittering red, resting on the handle of a designer handbag I didn't recognize. It was an image of pure, idle luxury. And the caption was a dagger. Finally upgrading from sawdust to sparkle. Number new beginnings, number level up. Sawdust, she used that word. The very dust that had coated her father's clothes, that had settled in the lines of his hands, the dust that was the byproduct of 45 years of honest, honorable work. The symbol of everything he had ever built, reduced to a dirty word. Something to be escaped from, to be upgraded. I thought of Frank's hands, their calloused palms and stained fingernails. Those hands had fixed her bicycle, built her dollhouse, and held her when she cried. And she was publicly celebrating their erasure, replacing them with a cheap, temporary sparkle. I closed the tablet and placed it on the coffee table. The small clink was the only sound in the room, and it was the only protest I had left. The waiting was over. My hesitation was gone. She wasn't my lost little girl anymore. She was a woman who had made her choices, who had publicly and proudly mocked the very foundation our family was built on. She had chosen her side. Now, she would have to live with it. Just then, my phone chimed with the sound of a new email. It was from Miss Albright. The message was short, professional, and as devastating as a bomb. Subject: CJ Enterprises v. Sterling Development. Body: courier has confirmed delivery of the cease and desist letter to their corporate headquarters. The clock is ticking. I read the words and felt a grim, cold calm settle over me. The bill had been delivered. The bill had been delivered. I imagined the scene as Miss Albright had described it, a world of glass and steel so different from my own. I pictured a courier, a young man in a crisp uniform, walking across the silent, polished marble floor of the Sterling Development headquarters. He wouldn't be intimidated by the massive, abstract sculptures or the hushed, important atmosphere. He had a job to do. A single, registered envelope to deliver into the hands of Mr. Envelope, Arthur Davies, CEO. In my mind's eye, Mr. Davies was a man sculpted from arrogance. He sat behind a desk so large and empty it looked like an aircraft carrier, talking on a headset, waving away his assistant who tried to hand him the letter. He was a man who didn't like interruptions. He probably thought it was another fawning invitation to a charity gala or a thank you note from a politician whose campaign he'd funded. Finally, with an annoyed sigh, he would pluck the envelope from his assistant's hand and slit it open with a silver letter opener. He would have scanned the first paragraph with casual disdain, the way you'd read the terms and conditions on a software update. Then his eyes would have stopped. They would have darted back to the top of the page, to the letterhead of Albright & Associates, a firm he would recognize, a firm known for its surgical and very expensive corporate litigation. He would have read the first sentence again, this time more slowly. This letter serves as a formal cease and desist notification regarding the property located at 14 Industrial Way and the fraudulent contract of sale executed by your firm. The confident smirk, the one he wore like a tie, would have faltered. He would have put his phone call on hold, his voice suddenly sharp. "Hold on," he'd snap, before sitting up straighter in his $1,000 chair. His eyes would have moved down the page, devouring the words, the legal phrases hitting him like a hail of stones. Fraudulent conveyance. Title held exclusively by CJ Enterprises since 2020. Power of attorney obtained under duress and therefore void ab initio. Failure of corporate due diligence. He would have seen the first attachment, a flawless notarized copy of the deed to CJ Enterprises with my name, Carol Jane Brooks, listed as sole proprietor. He would have seen the second, a notice of pending patents for a line of proprietary furniture designs, making it clear that even if he could somehow get the land, he could never touch what was inside. I pictured the color draining from his face, the healthy country club tan turning to a pale, waxy gray. This wasn't some mom-and-pop operation he could bully into submission. This was an ironclad multi-million-dollar legal disaster that had landed squarely on his pristine desk. The value wasn't just in the land, it was in the potential lawsuit from a firm that had never lost a case against a developer. His body language would have betrayed his panic. He'd loosen his silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. He'd hit the intercom button on his desk, his voice no longer smooth and commanding, but a harsh, panicked bark. "Get Jenkins and the entire legal team in my office. Now, oh." He'd be pacing by the time his lawyers scurried in, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. He'd throw the letter on the desk. "What is this?" he'd demand. "Who the hell is Carol Brooks? And why do I have a letter here saying we just bought a property from some crypto scammer kid who had no right to sell it? Did anyone bother to do a background check on the holding company?" The silence in the room would have been deafening. The blame would have started to fly. Junior associates looking at senior partners, everyone suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. But Davies wouldn't care about their excuses. He'd have only one priority: damage control. He'd point a trembling finger at his head of finance. "Kill the wire transfer. The full amount. If it's already sent, claw it back. I don't care what it takes." Then he'd turn to his top lawyer. "And you. Get our down payment back from that girl, Jessica Brooks. Sue her. Garnish her wages for the rest of her life. Ruin her. I want that money back, and I want her to be an example." And just like that, the battering ram had been launched. The scene faded from my mind, and I was back in my quiet living room. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, just like in the workshop. The only sound was the slow, steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock Frank had built for our 25th anniversary. Each tick felt like a footstep, the steady, inexorable march of consequences making their way across town. I hadn't felt a thrill of victory, just a grim, hollow certainty. The kind you feel when you've done something difficult but necessary, like setting a broken bone. It had to be done. But that didn't stop you from hearing the snap. My hand rested on the worn fabric of Frank's armchair. This was for him. This was for the sawdust, the calloused hands, the quiet dignity of a life spent building things that last. My daughter had chosen a life of sparkle and empty promises. Now, the empty promises were about to be called in. As if on cue, my phone, sitting silently on the end table, began to ring. The screen lit up with a picture of Jessica, smiling from a long-ago family vacation. Her name flashed on the screen. Jessica. It rang once, twice. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet house. It was the first tremor. The earthquake was coming. I looked at her smiling face, and with a steady hand, I pressed the button on the side of the phone, silencing the call. I would not be her refuge. Not yet. She had to stand in the rubble of the life she had chosen, and she had to do it alone. She had to stand in the rubble of the life she had chosen, and she had to do it alone. My phone rang 3 more times, one right after the other, before finally falling silent. An hour later, a string of frantic text messages began to pour in, each one a small digital firework of panic. "Mom, call me now. The bank is saying something crazy. Kyle is being a jerk. I need to talk to you. Please answer your phone." I read them all, my face impassive, then set my phone screen down on the kitchen counter. I could almost hear the dominoes beginning to fall across town. I imagined Jessica in that sterile white penthouse she was so proud of, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of a city that no longer belonged to her. She'd be looking at her laptop, her face pale, reading the first official email from the bank. It wouldn't be a gentle inquiry. It would be a cold, corporate execution. Subject: Notice of funds reversal and breach of contract. The words would be like a foreign language to her. Clawback provision, fraudulent conveyance, immediate repayment of the initial $500,000 deposit demanded. The first tremor of fear would have hit her then. She'd have called out for Kyle, her voice high and thin. He'd saunter over, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, an annoyed look on his face for being pulled away from whatever research he was doing on his computer. "What is this?" she'd ask, pointing a trembling red-nailed finger at the screen. "They're taking the money back. They can't do that, can they?" He'd have scanned the email, his fake bravado melting away with each damning legal phrase. The mask would drop. The blame would begin. "This is your mess," he'd spit, his voice suddenly hard. "Your crazy mother, your family's junk heap property. I told you this was too complicated." "My mess?" Her voice would rise, a shriek of disbelief. You're the one who found the buyer. You're the crypto king who said this was a sure thing." The deal was solid. He'd snap back, already moving toward the bedroom. "I can't help it if your family history is a legal landmine. I don't have time for this drama. I have real investments to manage." I could see it so clearly. Him, throwing his ridiculously expensive sneakers and tight shirts into a duffel bag. Her, following him, pleading, then screaming, the accusations growing more desperate. He wouldn't even look at her as he walked to the door. "I'm out," he'd say, a final, cowardly verdict. The door would click shut, leaving her alone in a vast, empty apartment filled with furniture that wasn't hers, overlooking a life that was no longer hers. The next domino would fall in the parking garage. After the frantic calls to Kyle's disconnected phone, she'd have gone down to the car, maybe to escape, maybe just to feel like she still had something. And she would have found it. The metallic blue BMW, the symbol of her upgraded life, hitched to the back of a greasy tow truck. A man in a jumpsuit, chewing on a toothpick, wouldn't even make eye contact as he handed her the repossession notice. The loud, unapologetic groan of the truck's hydraulics lifting her prized possession off the ground would have echoed through the concrete garage, a public announcement of her failure. Back in my kitchen, I watered the small pot of basil on my windowsill. The earthy smell filled the air, a scent of something real, something growing. My phone pinged again, a notification from my bank. A large wire transfer the developer's down payment had been returned to my holding company account, minus a small legal fee for Miss Albright. The money sat there, clean and quiet. It was done. The final domino, the one that would shatter everything, would have been the knock on the door. Not from Kyle, but from the building manager. His smile, once so eager and welcoming, would be gone, replaced by a look of cold, professional pity. He'd hand her a formal 24-hour eviction notice. The non-refundable deposit, her last bit of cash, was forfeited. The penthouse she'd bragged about to the world was now just a gilded cage she was being thrown out of. I imagined her, finally broken, sinking to the floor of that empty white room. The sparkle was gone, washed away by a tsunami of consequences. All she was left with was the truth, a mountain of debt, a lawsuit with her name on it, and the crushing weight of her own choices. The life she had built was a house of cards, and the slightest breath of reality had blown it all away. I looked around my own small, sturdy house. I saw the oak table Frank built, the bookshelves filled with worn paperbacks, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Nothing here was fancy. Nothing here would ever be posted on social media. But it was real. It was solid. It was ours. The frantic texts had stopped an hour ago. The silence from my phone was now absolute. She had hit the bottom. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I sat in my armchair, Frank's armchair, and waited. The storm I had unleashed was over. Now, all I could do was wait for the wreckage to wash up on my shore. And I knew, with a sad, grim certainty, that the next sound I would hear wouldn't be the ringing of a phone, but a soft, hesitant knock on my front door. The sound, when it finally came, was so soft I almost missed it. Not the confident knock of a neighbor or a delivery person, but a hesitant, scratching sound, like a stray animal seeking shelter from the storm. I walked to the front door and switched on the porch light. Its harsh yellow glare cut through the twilight, illuminating the wreckage that had washed up on my shore. It was Jessica, but a version of her I had never seen before. The woman from the Instagram photos was gone. In her place stood a ghost. Her expensive dress was wrinkled, as if she'd been sleeping in it. Her makeup was a mess, with dark tear tracks running through her foundation. Her feet were bare, her ridiculously high heels dangling from her hand, clearly impossible to walk in. And next to her on the porch was a single scuffed designer suitcase, all that was left of her grand, manifested dream. Her eyes, when they met mine, were wide and empty, stripped of all their previous arrogance and sparkle. They were the eyes of a child who was completely and utterly lost. I opened the door but didn't move from the threshold. I became a wall. We stood there for a long moment, the chirping of the crickets the only sound between us. The cool night air washed over me. She shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the fear. Finally, her composure, whatever was left of it, shattered. A raw, broken sob escaped her lips. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. My heart, the traitorous heart of a mother, ached to pull her inside, to wrap her in a blanket and tell her everything would be okay. But the woman who had made the call to Miss Albright, the woman who had sat calmly while her daughter's world burned, held her ground. I kept my face a mask of neutrality. I had to. This was the most important moment of all. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked. My voice wasn't angry. It was quiet, level, the voice of a businesswoman closing a deal. Her eyes welled up with fresh tears. "He's gone," she choked out. "Kyle, he just left. The bank, the developer, they're suing me. They took the car. The condo, Mom, they kicked me out. I have nothing." She gestured to the lone suitcase, a pathetic monument to her failure. "This is it. This is all I have. I don't have anywhere to sleep tonight." There it was, the full confession, the complete and total surrender. She had flown as high as her lies could carry her, and now she had fallen all the way back to earth, landing right on the welcome mat she had once scorned. I looked at my daughter, this broken stranger, and I felt a vast, aching emptiness. There was no triumph in this victory, only a grim, necessary sadness. I finally stepped aside, pulling the door open wider. For a flicker of a second, a look of relief crossed her face. She thought she was being welcomed home. She took a step forward, into the familiar warmth of the entryway, but I didn't lead her toward the living room. I turned and walked back through the kitchen, toward the back door that led to the yard, and beyond it to the dark, silent shape of the workshop. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I knew she was. She had no other choice. I stopped at the workshop's side door and flipped the switch for the exterior lights. The building was bathed in a stark, unforgiving light. I turned to face her. "You can stay here," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "In your old room. But this is not a hotel, and it is not a free ride. Your father and I worked every single day of our lives to build what we had. You thought you were above that. You're about to find out that you're not." Her face was a canvas of confusion and disbelief. What do you mean?" "I mean, there are consequences," I said, my voice as hard as the concrete we stood on. "Rent is due every morning at 8 a.m. sharp. You won't pay me with money because you don't have any. You'll pay with sweat. You'll pay with work. Here." I pointed to the workshop. "You will work off your debt to me one day at a time." From a hook just inside the back door, I took down a pair of Frank's old leather work gloves. They were stiff, stained, and smelled of wood and honest labor. I held them out to her. Her eyes widened in dawning horror. She looked from the gloves to my face, searching for a sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. She found none. "You want me to work in there?" she stammered. "Doing what?" "You'll start by sweeping the floors," I said, "and then you'll stack lumber, and then you'll sand, and you will keep doing it until I decide your debt is paid." She stared at the gloves as if I had handed her a pair of snakes. These were the hands that had just last week been wrapped around a champagne glass, that had sported a glittering manicure to celebrate her escape from the world of sawdust. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The place she had sold for being a worthless burden was now her only refuge. The work she had mocked was now her only currency. She stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the hum of the cicadas in the old oak tree. The fight was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary, hollow resignation. Slowly, like a person moving underwater, she reached out and took the gloves from my hand. Her perfectly shaped nails, now chipped and bare, brushed against the worn leather. I turned without another word and led her back into the house, up the stairs to her old childhood bedroom. It was neat and clean, but impersonal now, stripped of her teenage posters and filled with boxes of things I had in storage. It wasn't her room anymore. It was just a space, a place to sleep. "There are clean sheets in the closet," I said from the doorway. "My alarm is set for 7. I suggest you set one too. Don't be late." I pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the semi-darkness, the heavy work gloves still clutched in her hand. There was no goodnight hug, no comforting words. Forgiveness was a destination she had not yet earned, and the road to get there was going to be long, hard, and covered in sawdust. "Don't be late." That was the last thing I said to her. The next morning, my alarm went off at 7, as it always does. 10 minutes later, I heard the faint sound of a second alarm, the tinny digital chime from her phone, start and then abruptly stop. I was in the kitchen drinking my coffee when she appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a pair of expensive-looking yoga pants and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like she was ready for a Saturday morning jog to a coffee shop, not a day of hard labor. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her eyes puffy from crying, a look of sullen defiance on her face. I didn't say anything either. I just finished my coffee, rinsed the cup in the sink, and walked out the back door to the workshop. She followed. The first day was a disaster. I handed her a push broom, the big 24-inch kind, and told her to sweep the entire floor. It was a simple enough task, one a child could do. But she had no idea. She held the broom like it was a foreign object, pushing at the piles of sawdust which just seemed to billow up into the air and settle right back down again. After an hour, she had managed to create a small, pathetic-looking pile of dust in the center of the floor, and she was covered in a fine, pale film from head to toe. Her silk blouse was ruined. I didn't correct her. I didn't show her the right way to use her shoulders, to make long, even strokes. I just watched. At noon, I handed her a sandwich in a plastic bag and a bottle of water. She ate it sitting on an overturned bucket, still refusing to speak. The afternoon's task was to move a pile of pine 2x4s from one side of the shop to the other. The wood was heavy and rough. By the end of the day, her hands were red and raw, with splinters dotting her palms. Her face was a mask of misery and rage. She had never worked a day of manual labor in her life, and it showed. The next day, she showed up in a pair of old jeans and one of Frank's faded flannel shirts she must have found in the back of a closet. She still didn't speak, but it was a start. The days bled into one another. The work was simple, monotonous, and grueling. Sweep the floor, stack the lumber, organize the screws and nails into their little plastic bins, unload deliveries. I was her boss, not her mother. My instructions were brief and direct. This needs to be done by lunch. Don't stop until that pile is gone. I watched as her body changed. The soft, pampered look disappeared. New muscles she didn't know she had began to ache, then strengthen. The expensive manicure was a distant memory, her nails short and practical. Calluses began to form on her palms, a tough new layer of skin she was earning one splinter at a time. The sullen defiance slowly melted away, replaced by a weary, mechanical obedience. She would show up on time, do the work without complaint, and disappear back into the house at 5 o'clock, exhausted. We were like two strangers living under the same roof. The silence in the house was as heavy and thick as the sawdust in the air outside. There were times late at night when I'd hear her muffled sobs through her bedroom door, and the mother in me would ache to go to her. But I held back. This was a pain she had to feel, a cure she had to swallow on her own. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic, tearful confession. It was as quiet and subtle as the settling of wood dust. It was about 3 weeks in. I decided she was ready for a new task. I led her to Frank's workbench, to the last project he had ever worked on, a set of oak cabinet doors for a kitchen remodel. One of them was still rough, unsanded. "Today, you're going to learn how to finish," I said, handing her the orbital sander. I showed her how to load the sandpaper, starting with the coarse 80 grit. I showed her how to move the sander in slow, even circles, letting the machine do the work. "Don't press down too hard," I warned. "You'll leave marks." She took the sander, her movements clumsy at first. The machine vibrated loudly in her hands, and she struggled to control it, but she kept at it. She went through the grits, just as I'd told her, from 80 to 120, then to the fine 220 grit. I went back to the office to sort through some invoices, watching her from the small window. I saw the change happen. Her posture shifted, her focus narrowed. The world outside of that single piece of oak disappeared. It was just her, the tool, and the wood. I saw a flicker of her father in the intense line of her brow, in the steady, careful movement of her hands. At lunchtime, she didn't stop. I brought her sandwich out, and she just shook her head, never taking her eyes off her work. Finally, late in the afternoon, she switched off the sander. The sudden silence was startling. She stood for a long moment, looking at the cabinet door. Then, she took off the work gloves and ran her bare hand, the one with the new calluses, over the surface of the wood. It was as smooth as glass. A slow, wondering look spread across her face. It wasn't a smile exactly, it was something deeper. It was the look of a person who had just discovered they could create something beautiful with their own two hands. She sat down on the old wooden crate by the workbench, the same one her father used to sit on, and unwrapped her sandwich. She ate slowly, her eyes still on the perfectly finished piece of oak. She looked at her own hands, at the dirt under her nails and the tough new skin on her palms, not with disgust, but with a kind of dawning respect. She had done that. She had taken something rough and made it perfect. From the office, I watched my daughter finally understand the lesson her father had tried to teach her whole life. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the pride that comes from honest work. It was about the quiet dignity of a job well done. It was about the difference between the fleeting sparkle you can buy and the lasting, solid beauty you have to build yourself. At 5 o'clock, she brought the finished cabinet door to me in the office. She held it out, not saying a word. I took it from her. It was heavy, solid. I ran my own hand over the surface. It was perfect. I looked at her, at my daughter, her face smudged with sawdust, her eyes tired but clear for the first time in years. I gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an embrace. But it was respect. And for the first time in a very long time, I saw a flicker of her father's daughter looking back at me. "Don't be late." That was the last thing I said to her. The next morning my alarm went off at 7, as it always does. 10 minutes later, I heard the faint sound of a second alarm, the tinny digital chime from her phone, start and then abruptly stop. I was in the kitchen, drinking my coffee, when she appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a pair of expensive-looking yoga pants and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like she was ready for a Saturday morning jog to a coffee shop, not a day of hard labor. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her eyes puffy from crying, a look of sullen defiance on her face. I didn't say anything either. I just finished my coffee, rinsed the cup in the sink, and walked out the back door to the workshop. She followed. The first day was a disaster. I handed her a push broom, the big 24-inch kind, and told her to sweep the entire floor. It was a simple enough task one a child could do, but she had no idea. She held the broom like it was a foreign object, pushing at the piles of sawdust, which just seemed to billow up into the air and settle right back down again. After an hour, she had managed to create a small, pathetic-looking pile of dust in the center of the floor, and she was covered in a fine, pale film from head to toe. Her silk blouse was ruined. I didn't correct her. I didn't show her the right way to use her shoulders, to make long, even strokes. I just watched. At noon, I handed her a sandwich in a plastic bag and a bottle of water. She ate it sitting on an overturned bucket, still refusing to speak. The afternoon's task was to move a pile of pine 2x4s from one side of the shop to the other. The wood was heavy and rough. By the end of the day, her hands were red and raw, with splinters dotting her palms. Her face was a mask of misery and rage. She had never worked a day of manual labor in her life, and it showed. The next day, she showed up in a pair of old jeans and one of Frank's faded flannel shirts she must have found in the back of a closet. She still didn't speak, but it was a start. The days bled into one another. The work was simple, monotonous, and grueling. Sweep the floor. Stack the lumber. Organize the screws and nails into their little plastic bins. Unload deliveries. I was her boss, not her mother. My instructions were brief and direct. This needs to be done by lunch. Don't stop until that pile is gone. I watched as her body changed. The soft, pampered look disappeared. New muscles she didn't know she had began to ache, then strengthen. The expensive manicure was a distant memory, her nails short and practical. Calluses began to form on her palms, a tough new layer of skin she was earning one splinter at a time. The sullen defiance slowly melted away, replaced by a weary, mechanical obedience. She would show up on time, do the work without complaint, and disappear back into the house at 5 o'clock, exhausted. We were like two strangers living under the same roof. The silence in the house was as heavy and thick as the sawdust in the air outside. There were times, late at night, when I'd hear her muffled sobs through her bedroom door, and the mother in me would ache to go to her, but I held back. This was a pain she had to feel, a cure she had to swallow on her own. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic, tearful confession. It was as quiet and subtle as the settling of wood dust. It was about 3 weeks in. I decided she was ready for a new task. I led her to Frank's workbench, to the last project he had ever worked on, a set of oak cabinet doors for a kitchen remodel. One of them was still rough, unsanded. "Today, you're going to learn how to finish," I said, handing her the orbital sander. I showed her how to load the sandpaper, starting with the coarse 80 grit. I showed her how to move the sander in slow, even circles, letting the machine do the work. Don't press down too hard, I warned. You'll leave marks. She took the sander, her movements clumsy at first. The machine vibrated loudly in her hands, and she struggled to control it, but she kept at it. She went through the grits, just as I'd told her, from 80 to 120, then to the fine 220 grit. I went back to the office to sort through some invoices, watching her from the small window. I saw the change happen. Her posture shifted, her focus narrowed. The world outside of that single piece of oak disappeared. It was just her, the tool, and the wood. I saw a flicker of her father in the intense line of her brow, in the steady, careful movement of her hands. At lunchtime, she didn't stop. I brought her sandwich out, and she just shook her head, never taking her eyes off her work. Finally, late in the afternoon, she switched off the sander. The sudden silence was startling. She stood for a long moment, looking at the cabinet door. Then, she took off the work gloves and ran her bare hand, the one with the new calluses, over the surface of the wood. It was as smooth as glass. A slow, wondering look spread across her face. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was something deeper. It was the look of a person who had just discovered they could create something beautiful with their own two hands. She sat down on the old wooden crate by the workbench, the same one her father used to sit on, and unwrapped her sandwich. She ate slowly, her eyes still on the perfectly finished piece of oak. She looked at her own hands, at the dirt under her nails, and the tough new skin on her palms, not with disgust, but with a kind of dawning respect. She had done that. She had taken something rough and made it perfect. From the office, I watched my daughter finally understand the lesson her father had tried to teach her whole life. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the pride that comes from honest work. It was about the quiet dignity of a job well done. It was about the difference between the fleeting sparkle you can buy and the lasting, solid beauty you have to build yourself. At 5 o'clock, she brought the finished cabinet door to me in the office. She held it out, not saying a word. I took it from her. It was heavy, solid. I ran my own hand over the surface. It was perfect. I looked at her, at my daughter, her face smudged with sawdust, her eyes tired but clear for the first time in years. I gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an embrace, but it was respect. And for the first time in a very long time, I saw a flicker of her father's daughter looking back at me. That single, curt nod of respect was more than I had given her in a month. It was a crack in the wall of ice between us, and in the weeks that followed, a fragile thaw began. The silence in the workshop was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the heavy, sullen silence of a prison, but the quiet, focused silence of concentration. She started to ask questions. At first they were simple, practical. Where does this wood come from? What's the difference between a rip cut and a cross cut? I would answer her in the same way Frank had taught me, directly, without any fuss. The oak is from Pennsylvania. The pine is from up north. A rip cut goes with the grain. A cross cut goes against it. You use a different blade for each. She absorbed everything like a dry sponge. The work was no longer a punishment to be endured. It was a puzzle to be solved. I started giving her more complex tasks, learning to use the table saw, making precise measurements, even learning the delicate art of applying wood stain without leaving streaks. One evening, I came out to the workshop after dinner to find her there, long after her shift had ended. She was on her hands and knees, painstakingly reorganizing the chaotic collection of nuts and bolts on the bottom shelf, sorting them into labeled jars. She wasn't told to do it. No one was watching. It was an act of ownership, of care. She was tending to the legacy, not because she had to, but because she finally understood that it was worth tending to. That's when I knew it was time. The next evening, I had 2 mugs of coffee waiting on the small, cluttered desk in the office. When she came in from the main floor, wiping the sawdust from her hands onto her jeans, she stopped in the doorway, surprised. "Sit down, Jessica," I said, my voice softer than it had been in a month. She sat cautiously in the rickety visitor's chair, her eyes full of a weary uncertainty. I didn't say anything. I simply pushed the heavy, leather-bound ledger across the desk toward her. "Start from about a year ago," I said. "I want you to read it." She looked at me, then down at the book, and opened it. I watched her face in the stark light of the single bare bulb as she read her father's words. I saw confusion, then a flicker of shame, then a wave of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow. She was reading the story of a battle she never knew was being fought. She saw her own name on the page, her own casual cruelty reflected in her father's pained, private handwriting. She saw his steadfast refusal to sell, his stubborn pride, his deep, abiding love for the place she had so easily dismissed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming with tears. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice thick with a regret that was raw and real. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then, I slid the folded deed for CJ Enterprises across the desk. She unfolded it. She saw my name, Carol Jane Brooks, listed as the sole proprietor. She saw the date it was signed, years before Frank even got sick. Her face crumpled. The full, staggering weight of her own foolishness and her father's quiet, protective genius hit her all at once. She finally understood. The life she had tried to build was a fantasy, but the legacy she had tried to sell was a fortress, and her father had put the keys in my pocket all along. "He knew," she choked out, tracing my name on the paper with a trembling finger. "He knew I couldn't be trusted." "He knew you were lost," I corrected her, my voice gentle but firm. "He was trying to protect you from yourself." I stood up. "Come on, there's one more thing you need to see." I led her out to the main workbench, the place where her real education had begun. I reached under the bench and pulled out the canvas rolls, the ones I had re-hidden after our first visit. One by one, I unrolled the blueprints under the bright workshop lights, their brilliant hand-drawn designs covering the entire surface of the bench. The modular bookshelf, the convertible high chair, the space-saving coffee table. Jessica stared, her mouth slightly agape. She walked around the bench, looking at each design from a different angle. She was no longer seeing them with the eyes of a seller, but with the eyes of a builder. She saw the elegance in their simplicity, the genius in their practicality. I never knew," she said again, her voice full of a reverence I had never heard from her before. "I thought he just made cabinets." Your father didn't leave us an inheritance to spend, Jessica," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of everything we had been through. "He left us a business to build. This is the real legacy. This is the gold in the walls he wrote about." She finally turned to face me, her eyes clear and full of a pain that was honest and earned. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said, and this time the words weren't a desperate plea for shelter. They were a confession. "I'm sorry for not seeing. I'm sorry for being so stupid, for thinking this was all just junk." Her voice broke. "I didn't respect him, and I didn't respect you. I threw it all away." "Yes, you did," I said, because the truth needed to be spoken. "But it's not all gone. It's right here. It's waiting." I looked at her, at this new woman standing before me, her hands calloused, her face smudged with the dust of her father's work. "Now, the question is, are you ready to earn it?" She didn't answer with words. She looked back down at the blueprints, her gaze settling on the design for the interlocking bookshelf. She leaned closer, her eyes tracing the clever, intricate lines of the joints. A flicker of genuine intellectual curiosity lit up her face. How did he do this?" she asked, pointing to a specific connection. "There are no fasteners. How does it hold together?" I picked up a piece of scrap oak from the bin beside the bench and reached for one of Frank's pencils, its lead worn down to a flat nub. I pulled the blueprint closer, into the shared circle of light between us. "Let me show you," I said, and with the ghost of a smile, I began to draw. "Let me show you," I said. And in that moment, under the stark light of the bare bulb in the back of an old workshop, a mother and a daughter started to build something new. We began not with a business plan, but with that single interlocking joint. I drew, and she listened. Then she drew, and I corrected. We were no longer boss and prisoner, no longer parent and child. We were two apprentices, learning the language of her father's hands, together. The months that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. We didn't just clean the workshop, we resurrected it. We spent our days turning Frank's beautiful hand-drawn blueprints into tangible objects. The air, once thick with the dust of memory, was now filled with the fine, fresh powder of creation. I taught Jessica how to use the table saw, how to feel the bite of the blade on a piece of hard maple. She, in turn, with her modern instincts, taught me how to build a simple website, how to take clean, well-lit photos of our work that showcased its simple elegance. We called our new venture Frank's Legacy, and our first product was the convertible high chair. We took our prototype to the annual county craft fair. We set up a small booth between a woman who sold homemade jam and a man who carved birds out of driftwood. For hours, people would walk by, offering polite smiles. I started to feel a familiar doubt creep in. Maybe Frank's genius was too quiet for this loud, modern world. Then, a young couple, the woman visibly pregnant, stopped at our booth. The man, an engineer by trade, spent 20 minutes examining every joint, every mechanism. He was silent, his expression intense. "This is brilliant," he finally said, looking up from the chair, not at me but at Jessica. "The way this converts, the stability. My wife and I, we live in a small condo. This is exactly what we need." He didn't ask about the price first, he asked about the man who designed it. And Jessica, my Jessica, stood there and told him all about her father, her voice filled not with shame or apology, but with a deep, authentic pride. We sold our first high chair that day, and 3 more from the orders we took. We weren't just selling furniture, we were selling a piece of Frank's story. Our life found a new rhythm, a quiet partnership built on shared work and mutual respect. We ate dinners together, not in stony silence, but with our sketchpads and notebooks spread out on the old oak table, debating the merits of a dovetail versus a box joint. The anger and betrayal that had once been a chasm between us was filled in, day by day, with sawdust and shared purpose. About a year after she first knocked on my door, I was in the office finishing up an invoice when I saw something that made me stop. Jessica was in the main workshop, standing next to a young man, a new apprentice we'd just hired. She was showing him how to sand one of the rocking chairs, her hands guiding his, her voice patient and clear. "You have to let the tool do the work," she was saying, the exact words I had said to her. "Feel the grain, the wood will tell you when it's ready." She wasn't just continuing the legacy, she was passing it on. She saw me watching and smiled. "Mom," she said, walking over. "Something came in today." From the workbench, she picked up a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. She carefully unwrapped it. It was one of her father's old chisels. The black walnut handle, worn smooth with his grip, gleamed under the shop lights. "A man who runs a pawn shop downtown brought it in," she said, her voice soft. "He bought it as part of a lot a while back. He saw our website, recognized Dad's maker's mark on the steel. He said it belonged here." She held it out to me, a piece of her father's soul returned home. I looked at the chisel, then at my daughter's hands, holding it, hands that were now strong, capable, and calloused. I reached out and put my hand over hers, the cool steel and warm wood between us. "No, honey," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the workshop. It belongs to us." In that moment, I finally understood. The plan I had made in my anger and grief, the tough love I had administered, wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of desperate, terrified faith. Faith that somewhere inside the daughter I had lost was the woman I was so proud of today. My real victory wasn't getting my property back. It was this. It was her. Frank's true legacy wasn't a collection of brilliant designs. It was the strong, compassionate, hardworking woman his daughter had finally become. True wealth isn't something you can inherit from a will or win in a lawsuit. It's something you have to build, day by day, with your own 2 hands. It's in the lessons you learn from your failures and the dignity you find in honest work. So let me ask you, if your life was stripped down to the studs, would you have the courage to pick up the tools and build it back stronger than before? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And for more stories about finding strength when you need it most, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for listening.